Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This webinar is brought to you by Strategies 2.0, a statewide collaborative funded by the California Office of Child Abuse Prevention. Today's webinar is Leadership Models for Improving Impact. The webinar is scheduled from 10 until 11:30 this morning. My name is Carrie Collins, and I will be the facilitator today. My role is to introduce the topic and the presenter, keep track of time, and help the presenter and all of you participants in any way that's needed. Also helping me on the line today is my colleague, Alma Tovar. In a moment, I'll introduce the presenter to you, but I want to go over a few of the webinar guidelines with you before we begin. So all of you have a taskbar, and you control that by this little red arrow here. And you can have the taskbar be open or you can close it, whatever your desire is. You are joining us today either by telephone or by your computer speakers. We recommend that you join us by telephone. It seems to have a clearer sound to it. But whatever you do, make sure that your volume on your computer is up and your volume on your telephone is up, because there will be a couple of videos in today's presentation, and you will want to be able to hear that. Greg will be asking some questions throughout the presentation today, and we encourage you to enter your responses into the chat box that you can see right here. Alma will be helping to monitor your questions, but you can also raise your hand, and if we are able to unmute you, we can unmute you and you can ask your questions directly to Greg. He will be allowing time throughout the presentation and at the end of his presentation for questions today. I have muted all of your microphones, your speakers, so don't worry about any outside noise that you might be having at your office or your home, wherever you're joining us today. We will not be able to hear any of that. So with that, I would love to introduce our speaker today. Our presenter is Gregory Bourne. Greg is the co-founder of Lead for Tomorrow and serves as the executive director. He has been working in the arena of leadership and community engagement for more than 30 years, during which time he has led numerous training sessions on topics such as community involvement, conflict resolution, collaborative problem solving, and leadership. He has served as a consultant to a wide range of public agencies and worked with citizen advocates across the socioeconomic and racial spectrum. Greg gave a presentation for us last year and just touched a little bit on leadership models, and many of those on the webinar said that they wanted more about leadership. So he was really gracious to agree to present another webinar for us. So at this time, I'm going to make Greg the presenter, and he will take over the reins.
Great. Thank you very much, Carrie. And welcome to everybody who's participating today. I hope this will prove to be, prove to be productive of your time. And we do want to make this as interactive as possible. So we do ask that you participate and ask questions, and I'd love to have those. Just trying to pull up the presentation now. Good. Carrie, is the PowerPoint up and looking good?
Everything's looking good, Greg.
Okay, thank you. So let me just say a little bit about our organization and what we're doing, just to give a little context, and then we'll get started forthwith. Lead for Tomorrow is an organization we founded back in 2011 to really look at creating a more peaceful society, and part and parcel of that is looking at positive parenting and leadership, two very important aspects of that, which we've really focused on as an organization. Excuse me. So a lot of our work is here in California. We do work in some other states, and we also work in 4 countries in Eastern Africa. And so it's interesting to see how leadership and community engagement work in different cultures, and I think it helps us become a little more adaptable to the situations we encounter. The purpose of today's webinar really is just to explore the ideas and approaches and different models to becoming effective leaders. And I think leadership is a challenging topic because it is impacted both by our own personal perspectives and attitudes and personalities, but there's a lot of external factors that impact leadership as well. We're going to try to get into as many of those as possible. What I'm hoping that we'll gain today is you'll gain some additional insights into the dynamics of leadership that will help you navigate in your leadership roles, wherever you are in your organization. And what we're going to be looking at is also that leadership comes in many forms, and whether you're in a leadership role in an organization or not, I think this will be relevant to you, hopefully. And then secondly, the goal is for you to gain some additional tools that will make you a more effective leader in whatever context that you're in. I thought it'd be interesting just to put this video or this slide in just as kind of acknowledging that to an extent this may be, this workshop may be a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, in that I'm going to be putting a lot of material out to you in a relatively short amount of time. So hopefully we can take in as much as possible during that time, during our time together. You know, there's so many ways that you can approach leadership, and there's so many impacts, and this workshop is really going to try to create that broad perspective, which I think will help understand the leadership situations in which we find ourselves, and also in situations where we are under the leadership of other people, and which can be very challenging, it can be fantastic, and it can be challenging. And so I'm hoping that we can get to some of those aspects that will help us. So to begin, I'd just like to ask you for a minute to put in the chat box, excuse me, what characteristics have you seen in leaders that you think makes them effective? I'd just like to see some of the ideas and perspectives that you have on those characteristics that you've seen. You can just think of maybe one person that you think is a really effective leader, and what are one or two qualities or characteristics that you see in that person. And we'll just kind of wait for a minute or two and see what kind of ideas you might come up with.
Greg, are you able to see those comments?
I am, and
great.
They're terrific.
I know, those are good.
Yeah. So I think all of these I would totally agree with. Great. Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about all of these. Yeah, healthy self-esteem and not threatened by change. Focused. Listening skills. Ambitious and daring. That's an interesting qualities. Good listening skills. Honesty. Empathy. Vision. Yeah, knowledgeable. Great, feeling valued. These are all great examples. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I guess I just turned off my screen, didn't I?
No, we can't see you anymore.
Back on.
But,
you can't?
Okay.
That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I'm glad you turned it.
There you
are. So let's flip that. Let's flip that scenario and talk about what have we seen that we think makes people ineffective as leaders. Again, just think about a situation in which you felt like that person was lacking in leadership skills, and what was it that you saw?
I see that several of us put micromanaging.
Okay. Yeah, I've got to scroll down at the bottom here. Sorry. Reactive instead of responsive, in addition to micromanage, that's good. Closed-mindedness, narcissism, yep. Poor social skills, rigidity, top down. Okay, great example. So you guys are obviously ahead of the curve on a lot of this. You've obviously observed qualities both of effective and ineffective leadership, and I think you're right on these. And I want to just reinforce some of these, maybe look at a few others as we go along. So let me see if I can get back to. So some of the things we're going to talk about is definitions of leadership, because again, how we even think about leadership is, I think, important to consider. The types of leadership, pathways to leadership, what are the traits of an effective leader, and you've already addressed the majority of the ones that I'll share with you, but I think may have a few more. Barriers to effective leadership. You might be a terrific leader, but there might be barriers put in your way, and then what are those and how do we overcome those? And then what we're leading up to is a type of leadership which I believe embodies the best of several different approaches to leadership that I call facilitative leadership. And we're going to look at what are the skills involved there and how can we develop those more effectively. So, there's a lot of times people want to debate management versus leadership. And to some extent, it's interesting. I'm not sure we need to spend a lot of time, but I did want to just put this idea out there because some people do say, well, that person's not a leader, they're a manager, or people argue about, so what is it that differentiates leading from managing? And so I found a definition, or actually it's not, it's kind of a hybrid that says, the challenge lies in making sure that you are leading your team as well as managing the day-to-day operations. Those who are able to do both will create a competitive advantage as both a leader and a manager. And an interesting question might be, what would your staff say if you were to ask them? Would they say you're a leader or a manager? And I think, again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I just wanted to bring it up because a lot of times people get hung up on this. And I'm going to argue that we're all leaders in some capacity, either in our personal life or in our professional life. And so we're going to talk about that, and just wanted to kind of bring this issue up because, again, sometimes people get, I think, a little hung up on, well, are you a manager or leader? And I think we can be both. So if you look up the definition of leadership, you could actually find more than 200 definitions. But the ones that I just pulled a few to give you some examples. The action of leading a group of people and in an organization, and a group of people or an organization. The art of motivating a group of people towards achieving a common goal. Equipping others with the right tools and strategies to maximize the success of an organization and the lives of individuals. So interestingly, all of these have some reference to a group of people and achieving the common good or the common goal. And so again, you can find many others, but I think these are pretty good certainly for our purposes today, and to just provide a little context. So let's think about the types of leadership, because depending on where we are in society, in our family, in our life, in an organization, there are various types of leadership that we can recognize, and some are good and some, I think, are somewhat limited. So autocratic leadership is just the style of leadership that we might think about as top-down, or hierarchical leadership, where there's a clear-cut leader who basically tells everybody what to do. And there are some contexts in which that's probably the best approach, and one would be the military, where decisions need to be made, and there's a real clear chain of command, and that's kind of the culture of being in the military. With that said, I think if you look at some of the research you can look at, even in the military, people are going to follow somebody who they believe is committed to them And so there are some qualities of even autocratic leadership which kind of create a sense of humanity and concern for one another. But in organizations, there can be a lot of limitations to this. And certainly if you're working in a community organization, autocratic leadership can come off as paternalistic, demanding, controlling. And if you're trying to encourage people to follow you down a path, that's not necessarily going to engender a positive response. Then there's transactional leadership, which we see in some organizations, which is basically based on rewards. You do well, you get a promotion. You don't do well, you get a demotion. So it's very transactional, depending on the result of the people involved or the people under a leader. And again, transactional leadership can serve to be a motivating factor for some people, but again, it sometimes undermines morale and other qualities that you want to see in an organization or when you're working with other people. Then you can think about a form of democratic or participative leadership, where maybe this is more the horizontal leadership model, where you engage other people in leadership in the sense of getting ideas and giving them responsibilities to do certain things. So when you think about a horizontal leadership, you still might be in a position of overall leadership, but you have teams of people, all of which are led by people, or maybe they're working as a group with a real sense of kind of common identity. So that's what is meant by that form of leadership. Free reign or laissez-faire leadership is really where you just let people, and this you find in some kind of entrepreneurial settings, where you just say to people, okay, here's the task, go out and get her done. And people are kind of on their own, and as long as they get it done to the satisfaction of the organization, things are great. And for some people that works well. If they're self-motivated, very inventive, creative, that's probably a reasonable approach. But for many people who are not as self-motivated or who need more structure, that might not work so well. So again, as you can tell, I think there's different contexts where any of these could be valuable. There are also downsides to some of these, some more than others, when you're thinking about leadership that would encourage others, create a vision, get people to follow after, and be part of moving a vision forward. Transformational leadership is that kind of leadership where you are working with a group of people, you're setting a vision, you're motivating people, and you really are trying to get people on board and very much of a team approach to solving a problem, for example. And so that's, in some ways, can embody some of the characteristics of some of the other forms of leadership. But certainly, you have to be very intentional if you're involved with transformational leadership, because the goal there is to motivate and to create a sense of community. And then finally, and maybe not finally, we could probably add a few other overall types of leadership to this. Servant leadership is really driven by the mentality of I'm serving other people, and it's very, there's a different set of motivations there oftentimes, in that you don't see, it's not about me, it's about the people that I serve. And again, there's some really strong qualities in that, and that we can talk a little bit more about later. But sometimes there's some situations where we need to maybe take a little stronger position on how we help people and motivate people. So as I say, I think all of these different types of leadership have some qualities that are positive, some that maybe not so much so in certain situations. Now, what are the pathways to leadership? I think this is an important thing that we oftentimes don't talk a lot about. Appointed leadership is simply a situation where somebody gets appointed into a leadership position by someone else in a leadership position, or a board, whatever it might be, and the qualities that that person has may or may not align well with the position they're put in. And so I think when we think about people being appointed into leadership, it's important to just kind of understand the dynamic around that. And again, it's just kind of awareness of what goes along with these pathways. take elected leadership as an example. Certainly, we mostly think about that in our political system, where we elect local government officials, state, federal officials. There are other, obviously, elected leadership positions in unions or in clubs or other types of organizations. But I think a lot of times, as we think about this in the context of our elected officials in the public square, so to speak, I would really make a strong distinction here between being elected and being a leader. There are some people that understand how to get elected, or they're recruited to be put in a position to be elected. Doesn't mean they're good leaders. And I think we can look at a lot of examples at kind of every layer of government over history and see that that's the case. And some people are fabulous at figuring out how to get elected to a position, but not necessarily very effective once they get there. Years ago, when I lived in Atlanta for a number of years, I did a lot of work for the city of Atlanta, and they have a huge city council, like 15, 17 members. And there were a couple people who continually were elected based on the fact that they really could stop projects. They were effective on kind of rallying people to stop things. But in the years I lived there and observed them, never did I see them actually initiate something to improve a particular situation the city was facing. And so you'd question, well, are they a good leader? Well, they were able to lead a group of people or figure out a way to stop projects, but they never really kind of put something out there to say, hey, here's a potential solution. And I think most of it would suggest that's probably a better definition of leadership. So we just have to be realistic about sometimes we just don't, people that are elected are not necessarily going to be providing the leadership we need. Seniority-based leadership is simply based on, okay, this person's been here the longest, they're next in line, they become the leader. And that can be a good thing, and it can not necessarily be a good thing, because sometimes, as we'll talk about a little later, there are skill sets that leaders need that, based on seniority alone, they may not have. And as I do leadership seminars or workshops or training in different organizations, I see this a lot, and I think it's unfortunate when somebody gets, based on seniority, put into a position of leadership, but then not given the additional skills they may need. There's a certain presumption that they've been here a long time, they've done a great job, certainly they'll be great at the next level, and that's just not a valid assumption, because there's a whole new set of potential responsibilities. So to me, one of the things that needs to happen on a regular basis is realizing that when we elevate people into leadership positions, certainly based on seniority, we need to look at capacity building. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think sometimes they think, well, I'm a leader now, I'm supposed to know all this stuff. Well, a lot of times that's just not the case, and it should not be a hindrance or considered demeaning to take some courses or build capacity in ways that one needs it. So I think this is unfortunately, I see this repeated time and time again in organizations to their detriment. And then assume leadership. A lot of times people assume leadership just because there's a leadership void. And that usually means somebody really understands the big picture and has some courage to step in when it's needed. So there are a lot of different ways to get to leadership, is my point. And I think we have to look at that and think about how we perceive of leadership, and whether or not just because we're in a position of leadership we know everything we need to know. One of the things I would just say, in my years of being involved with leadership at various levels, I've started a couple organizations, but I've done a lot of training for everything from grassroots community leaders all the way up to elected officials and kind of everything in between. And there's always something to learn. We can never get to a point of thinking, okay, I've learned it all. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm always faced with, what more do I need to learn? How do I handle situations with staff or with clients or with in other situations better? So I think we have to have an attitude as leaders when we're in leadership positions is, what more can I learn? What more do I need to learn? So let's talk a little bit, though, before we go further into that, just about some of the perceptions about pathways to leadership. So sometimes people think about, well, the pathway is I just need to know more. And yes, that's a good start, but it's not always enough. Some people think about the path to leadership as who you know. I just need to get mix in with these other people, these other leaders. I need to get to be close with a certain person, and then I'll be able to ride their coattails, into leadership positions. And I'm talking now about broad perceptions about leadership, not necessarily the ones that we would pursue, but I think a lot of people think about that. So you might look at a leader and say, well, they're only a leader because they were the protege of this person or whatever. Innate leadership skills and abilities. Sometimes people think, well, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Leadership is something you're born with. You either have it or you don't. And again, I think that's a limiting way of thinking about leadership. Some perceptions are, well, they earned it. They pull, and whether it's the person themselves or being perceived from others, they kind of worked hard and they earned their way into that position. And then finally, and not so flattering, is the idea of providing favors or kind of pandering to say, well, I just need to look good in front of this person so that I'll be able to kind of move forward in leadership. And sometimes we're prone to do that, right? We see an opportunity and some people feel like that's the only way I'm going to advance is if I do that. But it's a pretty shallow approach and will catch up with us if we're not truly prepared to be in a leadership position. So what are some of the motives for leadership? Well, certainly some people are in it to serve themselves. They're in it for the power, the prestige, the money, the notoriety. And so that's certainly, one set of motives. And, certainly a person could have all these motives, but usually there's going to be one that kind of dominates when you think about why somebody's motivated to get into leadership. Serving others, specific people or situations. You might have a real interest in a lot of the work that we all do, working with families or working with children, working with people who have been taken, like in the foster care system, whatever it might be. We might be in it just to serve that particular situation. And then there are folks that are motivated by just serving the common good, the community and society more broadly. I know a couple people. I know a mayor here in Davis, where I live, who made it very clear when he ran for mayor, I have no interest in using this as a stepping stone to be, into the legislature or wherever. I'm just here for the community. And he served one term and did accomplish some things and then move on. So some people truly do have the common good in mind. And I think we can tell oftentimes by people's actions if they've got the common good in mind or if they're there for their own power, prestige. And if that's the only reason people are in power, that usually goes south at some point. We can look at a lot of people who have unfortunately been removed from office or just found to have kind of crossed the line ethically, who end up, losing their positions of power. And so I would say, particularly in the public arena, hopefully we're well-based in areas of integrity to kind of keep us on the right track. It's easy. I think we all know about, power corrupts. And so I think to maintain good leadership, we have to really be well grounded in why we're there. And, not everybody's, it's kind of altruistic to think everybody's going to have the common good in mind. But, I think the more that we can be well grounded in the qualities that help us serve other people, the better we'll be as leaders. So what are some of the other perceptions about leadership? Well, it's only for the powerful or only for the well-educated. And I'm going to show you a video in a minute that's going to really, I think, point us in a different direction. That it requires money or status. If we don't have the money or the status, then we're not going to make it very far. We're not going to be able to become a leader. It requires innate abilities. We might think I'm just not outgoing enough, or I'm not, imagine any number of things. People could kind of berate themselves to say, I can't really lead. And the video we're going to see in a minute is going to present a very different view of that. The flip side of requiring innate abilities is the view that some people have, well, it can't be learned or developed. And I think my experience over the years is absolutely leadership skills can be learned or developed. Now, are they augmented by personality types, worldviews? Absolutely. But we can learn and develop skills to help us to be more effective leaders. And again, some people think of it as it requires pandering to get into leadership, and I think that's a very limited view. So what I'd like to do is show you this video and then take a minute to just let you reflect on anything I've said so far that you'd like to respond to, and also see what your responses are to this video. We're hoping the technology works, so bear with me as we try to tee this up. And so far, so good. Be a bad time for the server to go down, but it looks like we might be okay here. Okay, here we go.
I want to start by asking everyone in the audience here a question. How many of you are completely comfortable with calling yourselves a leader? See, I've asked that question all the way across the country, and everywhere I ask it, no matter where, there's always a huge portion of the audience that won't put up their hand. And I've come to realize that we have made leadership into something bigger than us. We made it into something beyond us. We made it about changing the world. And we've taken this title of leader and we treat it as if it's something that one day we're going to deserve. But to give it to ourselves right now means a level of arrogance or cockiness that we're not comfortable with. And I worry sometimes that we spend so much time celebrating amazing things that hardly anybody can do, that we convinced ourselves that those are the only things we're celebrating. And we start to devalue the things that we can do every day. And we start to take moments where we truly are a leader, and we don't let ourselves take credit for it, and we don't let ourselves feel good about it. And I've been lucky enough over the last 10 years to work with amazing people who have helped me redefine leadership in a way that I think has made me happier. With my short time today, I just want to share with you the one story that is probably most responsible for that redefinition. I went to a school in a little school called Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick. And on my last day there, a girl came up to me and she said, I remember the first time that I met you. And then she told me a story that happened 4 years earlier. She said, on my day before I started university, I was in the hotel room with my mom and my dad. And I was so scared and so convinced that I couldn't do this, that I wasn't ready for university, that I just burst into tears. And my mom and my dad were amazing. They were like, look, we know you're scared, but let's just go tomorrow. Let's go to the first day. And if at any point you feel as if you can't do this, that's fine. Just tell us, we will take you home. We love you no matter what. And she said, so I went the next day and I was standing in line getting ready for registration. And I looked around and I just knew I couldn't do it. I knew I wasn't ready. I knew I had to quit. And she says, I made that decision. And as soon as I made it, there was an incredible feeling of peace that came over me. And I turned to my mom and my dad to tell them that we needed to go home. And just at that moment, you came out of the student union building wearing the stupidest hat I have ever seen in my life. It was awesome. And you had a big sign promoting Shinorama, which is Students Fighting Cystic Fibrosis, a charity I've worked with for years. And you had a bucket full of lollipops. And you were walking along and you were handing the lollipops out to people in line and talking about Shinorama. And all of a sudden, you got to me and you just stopped and you stared. It was creepy. This girl right here knows exactly what I'm talking about. And then you looked at the guy next to me and you smiled and you reached in your bucket, you pulled out a lollipop and you held it out to him. And you said, you need to give a lollipop to the beautiful woman standing next to you. And she said, I have never seen anyone get more embarrassed faster in my life. He turned beet red, and he wouldn't even look at me. He just kind of held the lollipop out like this. And I felt so bad for this dude that I took the lollipop. And as soon as I did, you got this incredibly severe look on your face, and you looked at my mom and my dad, and you said, look at that. Look at that. First day away from home, and already she's taking candy from a stranger. And she said everybody lost it. 20 feet in every direction, everyone started to howl. And I know this is cheesy, and I don't know why I'm telling you this. But in that moment when everyone was laughing, I knew that I shouldn't quit. I knew that I was where I was supposed to be, and I knew that I was home. And I haven't spoken to you once in the 4 years since that day, but I heard that you were leaving. And I had to come up and tell you that you've been an incredibly important person in my life, and I'm going to miss you. Good luck. And she walks away, and I'm flattened. And she gets about 6 feet away, she turns around and smiles and goes, you should probably know this too. I'm still dating that guy 4 years later. A year and a half after I moved to Toronto, I got an invitation to their wedding. Here's the kicker. I don't remember that. I have no recollection of that moment. And I've searched my memory banks because that is funny and I should remember doing it. And I don't remember it. And that was such an eye-opening, transformative moment for me to think that maybe the biggest impact I'd ever had on anyone's life, a moment that had a woman walk up to a stranger 4 years later and say, "You've been an incredibly important person in my life," was a moment that I didn't even remember. How many of you guys have a lollipop moment, a moment where someone said something or did something that you feel fundamentally made your life better? All right. How many of you have told that person they did it? See, why not? We celebrate birthdays where all you have to do is not die for 365 days. And yet we let people who have made our lives better walk around without knowing it. And every single one of you has been the catalyst for a lollipop moment. You have made someone's life better by something that you said or that you did. And if you think you haven't, think about all the hands that didn't go back up when I asked that question. You're just one of the people who hasn't been told. But it is so scary to think of ourselves as that powerful. It can be frightening to think that we can matter that much to other people. Because as long as we make leadership something bigger than us, as long as we keep leadership something beyond us, as long as we make it about changing the world, we give ourselves an excuse not to expect it every day from ourselves and from each other. Marianne Williamson said, "Our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light and not our darkness that frightens us." And my call to action today is that we need to get over that. We need to get over our fear of how extraordinarily powerful we can be in each other's lives. We need to get over it so we can move beyond it. And our little brothers and our little sisters, and one day our kids, or our kids right now, can watch us start to value the impact we can have on each other's lives more than money and power and titles and influence. We need to redefine leadership as being about lollipop moments. How many of them we create, how many of them we acknowledge, how many of them we pay forward, and how many of them we say thank you for. Because we've made leadership about changing the world, and there is no world. There's only 6 billion understandings of it. And if you change one person's understanding of it, one person's understanding of what they're capable of, one person's understanding of how much people care about them, one person's understanding of how powerful and agent for change they can be in this world, you change the whole thing. And if we can understand leadership like that, I think if we can redefine leadership like that, I think we can change everything. And it's a simple idea, but I don't think it's a small one. And I want to thank you all so much for letting me share it with you today.
Looking to grow your business?
So I'd be very interested in any comments or observations that you have about either the video or anything else we've talked about so far.
I see that Ariane Porras, you have your hand up, but you are self-muted. Did you want to ask a question? You'll have to unmute yourself if you're going to ask Greg a question, but I do see that your hand is up. Ariane Porras. Sorry, that was an accident. Okay. She took her hand down. But you do have some comments, Greg. Do you want you want to read those, or do you want Alma to read those for you? Whatever you desire.
Maybe read them, so that'd be great. It's easy me scrolling down.
Okay, Alma, you're on.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. It says, I appreciate how he redefined leadership and placed it in an everyday context. And let me see if there's more. Frame it so it's more attainable.
Yeah, these are really right on the point. We've been talking a little bit about, in organizational or in these larger contexts, but one of the key points I wanted to make today in this workshop is that leadership starts with, as he points out, Drew Dudley points out, just with an active leadership we can take in our everyday life. Maybe it's somebody at work, maybe it's somebody maybe it's a client, maybe it's somebody in our family, etc. And so we need to, I think, break out of this idea that leadership only occurs in these kind of settings that we typically associate with leadership. And this speaks to, I think, a broader view of leadership that helps us maybe find a better foundation for us, even if we're leaders in a large organization. I just noticed a comment saying I never really thought about these lollipop moments that I've done for people. It made me rethink a little. Absolutely. And, a lot of times we've talked a little bit about the things that prevent us from being good leaders, like arrogance and some of those kinds of things. And Drew Dudley's saying on the flip side of that, we don't give ourselves credit for the leadership we can exert, even in one-on-one situations with somebody, a kind word or something that we can do. Our organization has been part of an initiative in Yolo County, which is moving throughout the state, called Be the One. And it kind of builds on this idea that we can be the one, and the research on resilience shows the same thing, that all it takes is one encouraging person to change somebody else's life. And so I think that's kind of the model put out here. And maybe we don't think of it as leadership, but I think there's an argument for saying, absolutely it is. Okay, so let's. Yeah.
This is Carrie. I'm really interested in Joe Boussault has a comment. Great video. I think that many of the systems I work in have a very real power circle. So I'm curious if I can unmute Joe and have him tell us more about that.
That'd be great.
So Joe, I don't know if you're willing. Oh no, Joe's not on. He's not on the computer. He's just watching. Joe, put in the chat box a little bit more about that. If he's still with us.
Oh yeah, I see what he's saying. I think that many of the systems I work in have a very real power circle. Excuse me. Absolutely. That is another form of leadership where people surround with other people, and then that kind of creates a little bit of a leadership bubble, you might describe, and penetrating that bubble is difficult because what it really means is the person at the top has likely, it doesn't always mean this, but a lot of times it means the person at the top has pulled in other people around them that kind of insulate them, and it's usually people that agree with how that person sees the world. Whether you want to think about, yes people or somebody that just kind of, as I say, insulates them, and then if you're outside of that circle, it can be very frustrating. And I think most people would suggest that that's an ineffective form of leadership. Sometimes you see elected officials who purposefully pick people from the other party specifically to hear what their point of view is. And it happened in the early days when Washington and Adams and Jefferson were presidents. They oftentimes pulled people from the other party and just to hear these other points of view. It's a much healthier form of leadership than just surrounding yourself with a few people that support everything you say. Very interesting point.
Yeah, and Joe added to his comments, I think it used to be referred to as the good old boys club. But see, the powerful folks pick and choose, kind of like what you just said, staff and colleagues based on loyalty. So very much like what you were just saying.
Yeah, and loyalty is not a bad thing at all in an organization. You want people to be moving forward to the same, but sometimes loyalty can be blind as well. And if you're too close to it, or if the motivations are not sound, like you're just trying to maintain power. And we see this in a lot of autocratic countries, right? They surround themselves with military or people that keep them in power, and then they expect loyalty. And and I see another thought from Joe, at times undervalue different views. Yeah, exactly. So any other questions, maybe not related to the video, of anything I've talked about previously, kind of motives, pathways, anything else people would like to either ask a question about or comment on? Okay. So let's, picking up on the video we just saw, let's talk a little bit about what I think we could fairly call leadership layers. And and I want to start with just the idea of intrapersonal leadership. And that basically means taking control, if you will, over our own lives and our own situations and trying to, create either the discipline or the openness to new ideas or whatever it might be, but looking inside and being a little bit self-reflective about leadership, but that a lot of the rest of leadership begins with kind of the interpersonal part of it, what my motivations are, and why I'm pursuing this, and how am I getting there, and what am I having to do to get into a position of leadership? Is it consistent with my values? Those kinds of things. So I think leadership at some point begins right, inside of us to kind of dictate what we would do or what we think we need to do and how we should approach leadership. Interpersonal leadership is the impact we can have on another person, just like Drew Dudley was talking about, just one-on-one, being able to provide and leadership can mean being bold enough to provide a word of encouragement. That can be leadership. And so I think, we don't have to define it in any more broader terms than that. Then there's, of course, organizational leadership. When we get into an organization, we're part of a leadership structure. And, that has all kinds of issues associated with it, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And then those get even expanded further when we think about community leadership or societal leadership. Back to the, I'm just looking at a comment from Joe that I want to come back to in a minute. The idea of emotional intelligence in leadership is really critical. And this, in a part, relates to this notion of intrapersonal leadership. So there's a lot of research that has gone on about, that has been undertaken to look at leaders and connect that with emotional intelligence. And there's a high correlation between effective leadership and high emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is defined as self-awareness, being willing to see our own flaws and understand that, yes, we have certain strengths, but we also have certain areas that we could, kind of learning edge that we could, learn more about, but being aware of those things. And then there's self-regulation. When somebody makes us angry, do we just kind of blow off and come back in a very aggressive manner, or can we regulate that reaction? As somebody I think pointed out earlier, sometimes it's some ineffective leaders are reactionary rather than reflective, which is a really good observation. Do we have the capacity to be a little bit more reflective in those situations and not just react immediately? Emotional intelligence is also kind of a self-motivation, having a passion about something and being motivated to make it happen and to not give up. Empathy, the capacity to try to walk in other people's shoes, see how they see it. We're going to be far more effective leaders if we have empathy and can understand what might be going on in the lives of our colleagues and our clients, whoever it might be. And then social skills, which is another way of just saying, are we good listeners and good communicators? And I can tell you from having worked in the public sector and the private sector, I've been at universities, I've worked with elected officials, I mentioned earlier, or community officials. These are really important qualities. And I've seen people in leadership positions who have no self-regulation whatsoever. They react, and they react in very negative ways to situations which they don't agree with, and that undermines openness to new ideas, it undermines morale, it undermines relationships. So the point of all this is just to say, again, the more we're aware of ourselves, the self-awareness, and we think about, can we develop a higher degree of emotional intelligence? And again, I think we can, but it all begins with self-awareness and the desire to, in fact, acquire some of these skills, to try to develop more empathy for people, to try to understand where people are coming from. That takes effort. Being a good listener takes effort. It really, listening rather than just thinking about what we're going to say. So I just wanted us to kind of touch on this aspect, which I think in my observation over the years working with leaders in all different capacities, that's a huge indicator of their effectiveness as a leader. So getting back to just a quick summary of traits of effective leaders, which I think you hit almost all of these when I asked the question earlier. But we expect an effective leader to be decisive when they need to be. So in other words, when we talk about facilitative leadership, we'll talk about how we want to hear from everybody, but at some point, a decision has to be made. And so it requires being decisive, but the way you get to making decisions is what makes all the difference. Effective leaders practice what they preach. They don't talk about one thing and act differently. And so if we're going to put out values that we hope other people will follow, we need to walk the talk and not just talk about it and then act in a way that's different. And I was involved in basically a situation a couple of years ago where I was brought into an organization that had a major public agency, had a major leadership issue. And one of the main problems was this: people were talking about one thing, but their behavior was totally contrary to what they said. And so it undermined their credibility as a leader. An effective leader doesn't lose sight of goals. There are a lot of things that can get in the way, a lot of curveballs. How do we handle those things? How do we keep our eye on the prize, so to speak, and keep clarity on what we're trying to accomplish? Because there are many things when we're in leadership positions that can try to tug us off in different directions. It can be personnel issues, it can be resources, it can be any number of things. Effective leaders are passionate about what they do. I was involved with an organization years ago that the leader was an academic individual who had started a for-profit company, and he was great in many respects, but he didn't have all the skills needed to run the organization. So they brought in somebody from the outside. This person he had business acumen, but he wasn't passionate about what he did as an organization. And the leadership at that point was actually worse than when the founder was running the company, because I think largely the person didn't fully understand what we were doing and was not passionate about it. Very difficult to try to sell it or to market it or to really make it happen if we're not passionate about what we're doing. Humble and accountable. Really important qualities. It takes the humility to be willing to learn, to understand, hey, I don't know everything, and yet there's an accountability there as well that, hey, I'm going to be held accountable to what kind of back to the practice, what we preach. I need to be held accountable to that as well. A few other here: give credit where credit is due. There's a great book called Good to Great, based on some research a guy at Stanford did a number of years ago, and he said the great leaders are the ones that, if it doesn't go well, take responsibility for it, and if it does go well, give credit to the people that made it happen. And that's a really important quality. Help people grow. Not just see people as people to do things and just to get a job done, but how do we help grow people and help them be ready to take a next level of leadership if that's where they want to go. I work with a number of organizations where I realize that the people there, they're really good at what they're doing, and that's what they want to do for their career. That's what they love. That's what they have a passion for. So we want to help people grow in the context they want to grow, but not always thinking, hey, that's going to be our next, manager. Maybe not. Communicate effectively is critical. Confident, and somebody brought this out earlier, kind of being daring, confident and afraid of the unknown, unafraid of the unknown. And again, particularly in this day and age where things are changing so fast and there's so much awareness of everything else going on in the world, there's always opportunities for changing, and if we don't do it ourselves, it's going to be put on us, and we need to be ready to embrace that and say, how do we need to change to keep up with the times, or to be more effective, or to more effectively meet our client needs? And so any position we're in, I think we can always kind of look at how can we do that. And then being trustworthy. Some of the research I've done suggests that 60% of people do not trust the leaders in their organizations. 60%. That's a very troubling number. So I think it really calls on leaders to really reflect on, can I be trusted? And if not, why not? And it's definitely a quality that if you look at the research, it says, hey, what do you value in a leader? Trustworthiness comes really close to the top in most of those kinds of polls. So what are the traits of ineffective leaders that we've all seen, and maybe we actually embody some of these at times? And that's the reason I'm putting it up here. It'd be nice for us to think about and reflect a little bit. Do we display some of these characteristics, and are there ways that we can, through our own self-awareness and self-regulation, become a more effective leader by not falling into these traps? Arrogance is a certain one that a lot of people identified earlier. Feeling entitled to special privileges and respect. And again, there's a certain, basically it's a level of entitlement that I now that I'm in this position, I deserve this, I deserve that. Regardless of what you think about his politics, when this will age me a little bit, when Jimmy Carter was president, he never had pomp and circumstance, or here comes, what is it, Hail to the Chief. He never had that played at state meetings. The older President Bush never talked about, I did this, I did that. In fact, he used to joke about how his mother would chastise him if he said, oh yeah, I got this done. He would hear from his mother that, you don't draw attention to yourself. It's pretty interesting. We see some people that are just disorganized by no fault of their own. But I think we can all learn to be more organized. Some people are just kind of create conflict and create chaos, and just by being disorganized. Or some people actually use it as a tactic because they find that they thrive in chaos, and the vast majority of people do not. And so it can be just the way it is, but it can also be actually a strategy, kind of a Machiavellian strategy. And again, you might achieve an end that you're looking for, but as an organization, this is just a killer. Making excuses for things rather than just accepting responsibility, this accountability part we just talked about earlier. Being accountable and say, okay, yeah, we really messed that up, and we'll make sure that we do our best not to have that happen again. Or pointing fingers, they did it. It was their problem, their fault. And again, as leaders, we really need to make sure we don't fall into that, because then, again, we're undermining staff, and there are a lot of problems attached to that. Sometimes people, I've seen quite a few, unfortunately, leaders who lack people skills. They just don't get it. And they yell at people. They don't listen to people. They'll say one thing and do another. So people with limited people skills typically can be in positions of leadership. As I say, I've seen it numerous times, but everybody understands around them that that person's not a good leader. So it's just a direct correlation. Another trait is don't support employees. Don't have people's back. And sometimes, sorry, I'm just reading a comment, trying to keep up with the comments. I'm going to have to take a pause here in a minute. We'll look at some of them. And then untrustworthiness we've talked about, and you guys, many of you identified micromanagement as the trait of an ineffective leader. And it's kind of interesting because micromanagement can be the desire of a kind of a control thing, where the person just wants to be in control of everything. And of course, that limits the growth of other people. And I've seen it either where they want to micromanage on a subject they don't really know anything about, which is, even in other words, want to micromanage a technical expert. It's really debilitating. And yet some people need a little bit more support and guidance. And so from a leader's perspective, it can sometimes be a challenge to say, where do I give sufficient structure and guidance without taking that step over to actually micromanaging? So that can be a challenge. I want to just come for a minute, if you bear with me. I want to read a couple of these comments. So a question about the 60% that don't trust their leaders. Is this an issue of naturally distrusting authority, or is this part of leadership inadequacy, or both? I would say it's both. From my experience, I can't point to the research behind the 60%. I think there are a percentage of people, there is a percentage of people who basically just distrust authority. So it's a really good point you make. But why do they distrust authority? It's because they're untrustworthy or they've not shown any empathy. And right, usually if a leader is untrustworthy, it's because of some of the things we've looked at that make people ineffective leaders. So I think in large part, those two kind of go, leadership inadequacy can lead to or reinforce the idea of not trusting authority. And so I think at some level, maybe hard to separate the two. Yeah, here's somebody who actually had a boss who made people cry. Yeah, that's never a good thing. Yeah, and this idea that ineffective leaders don't see it and don't better themselves. I've done a number of leadership trainings for middle management in public agencies, and a very common refrain after these meetings, I usually get one or two people that come up and say, hey, this has been great, but you need to be talking to the people right above us, because they're just kind of in this other mentality of what it means to be a leader and just kind of running roughshod over everybody else, or not displaying some of the skills that we're talking about. So there is, this gets back to self-awareness, the desire to become a better leader rather than just being stuck in a place and saying, this is what it is. You get me, whatever me is, as opposed to saying, hey, maybe there's a better version of me that can be a more effective leader. And sometimes it requires going around or over that person if needed to help change situations. It's not always possible, but sometimes, even though it's not desirable, it might be what needs to happen. So I also want to not put the bullet on the bullseye on the back of leaders, because there's a lot of challenges to leadership that I want to just make sure we acknowledge. There is content and subject matter. So once we get into higher and higher levels of leadership, there's more and more things that we need to be at least aware of and familiar with to be an effective leader. And it can be things like content and subject matter. I need to know what I'm talking about. It's kind of like the person that came into the company I worked with out of grad school that didn't have the passion, didn't really understand what we were doing. It was somewhat technical. Basically, we need to understand the content. We need to understand the kind of the workplace environment. That can be things like who's in what office, and do they have a window or not, or do they have a private office or a cubicle, or just all those kinds of things that we need to deal with. Interface with the external environment, clients and suppliers, and a board or a council or an advisor council. There's a lot of external aspects of leadership that one needs to deal with. There's the issue of sustainability, and oftentimes it's finances, sometimes it's other things, but just the idea of how do we sustain this operation and deal with our finances and make sure we're doing well by our finances. Personnel issues. This can be a huge drain of time for leaders, unless you have a big enough organization where you can have an HR department. But in smaller organizations, that's not always the case, and so it falls to people in leadership positions to deal with. And again, this might be an area where it's very difficult. We don't have expertise. That can be really challenging. Inspiration and motivation. We're supposed to be inspiring people that we work with to do their best and to be motivated, and that's an important quality to have. Communication and being able to resolve conflict. I'll say a little bit more about that later, because conflict resolution is certainly an important, being able to solve conflict effectively. We're going to encounter conflict as leaders. Let's just embrace that idea. And again, research shows about 60% of people tend to want to avoid conflict. I don't know what is about 60%, but anyway, about 60% of people tend to avoid conflict. And there are times in which that's okay, but as a leader, we really can't afford to do that. We really need to embrace conflict and look at it through the lens of what can I learn, what can the organization learn, what can the people who are in the conflict learn, and try to move that forward. So I thought it'd be important to say a little bit about the barriers to effective leadership, because there are things that are happening outside of me in a position of leadership, wherever that is. I'm saying middle management, but I think you'll gather from the rest of this that I would consider anybody in any kind of a leadership that have people working for you, you are in a leadership position. And if you have nobody working for you, you are in a leadership position because you're doing something valuable for the organization you're in, and maybe you're interfacing with clients or whoever. But we're all at some level, we're all in leadership positions. So what are some of the barriers to exerting effective leadership? Well, sometimes it's lack of support from the top. You might be having to deal with a particularly difficult issue, and whoever you report to, whether it's a board or another person or whatever, is not there for you. And then that's going to make your job very difficult and take a lot more time. Limited resources. Sometimes we're giving jobs to do with very limited resources, either people or funding or other kinds of material supplies, whatever. If we don't feel that we have the resources to do a job well, that's obviously a key barrier. Sometimes we get placed in a box. You might say, okay, this is your realm, and that's it. And it may be that your realm should be rightfully overlapping with other parts of an organization, but you're not given that opportunity. Sometimes, unfortunately, leaders can be undercut and therefore delegitimized. It can happen in a variety of ways. It can happen in a meeting. It can happen based on a decision that's been made where you felt you had the authority to make a decision, and then when another part of the leadership team found out, basically undercuts that. One thing that's really important, I've seen a number of times, is just a legacy of poor leadership. I did some work sometimes I work with cities, and I've been doing some work with some cities with their city councils and their lead, the department heads, to do some strategic planning and think about how to more effectively engage communities and whatnot. And in some cases, there's been a decade of poor leadership, and people that were hired under that leadership are used to a certain leadership paradigm, and that's not the leadership paradigm moving forward because it wasn't effective. But you've got people that were there under the previous regime. Now you have to figure out how to try to pull those people along and get them on board and get them working as part of a team in a positive way. But a lot of times people get stuck with where they were, and now you've got to figure out how to deal with that, short of having to change personnel. But certainly a legacy of poor leadership has carryover, which can be very challenging. The responsibility with no authority is, a horrible position to put someone in. So you're responsible for this, but you don't really have any authority over who you assign or what they do or timelines or resources. And so it's like, your hands are tied behind your back. And again, that can be a barrier to effective leadership, to give somebody the responsibility with no authority. And I think it's good for us in leadership positions to try to help the next generation of leaders, or the people that maybe we oversee, give them the authority. If we're going to give them the responsibility, give them some of that authority, and maybe you have to define what that is, because there's probably going to be some bounds to it. But, you say, hey, you have a total authority in these realms. If it's a budget issue, you need to come talk to me. But otherwise, just lay that out. But the responsibility with no authority is not a good position to be in. Given assignments for which you're not qualified or prepared, sometimes people just get set up to fail. I know a person, as an example, that was hired into a public agency that deals with very high-level public issues that are very controversial. And this person had never really been put in a position to deal with public engagement. And this person was now assigned to engage the public on one of the most controversial issues you'll find. That person was essentially set up to fail because they weren't experienced, and the person who should have been given that job was the person that was most experienced with controversial issues and dealing with the public. So, and I think sometimes if we see ourselves being put into a position where we feel like, hey, this is just, I'm going to be treading water on this, should be honest about that and say, I'd love to do this, but I need, some skill building, capacity building in some area. And, usually we don't want to admit that. But anyway, sometimes it's done to people, and that's really inappropriate. And then that's related to just not providing adequate training, as I've mentioned a couple times here, that sometimes we assume leaders just know everything they need to know. And the fact of the matter is, due to all the challenges we just went through a minute ago, no. I mean, who knows who is expert in all of those areas that we discussed? Not too many people. And so that's why we have to have other people who can fill in and provide leadership or provide skills. But unfortunately, too often people are put in positions of leadership without the training that they need. And then finally, on my list anyway, I'm sure there are other things we could identify, is bureaucratic inertia. Sometimes in bureaucracies in particular, there is just such inertia down a certain path that to try to be an effective leader in that context is very, very difficult. It's like, hey, this is the way we've done it for 30 years. And there's not the organizational will to say, hey, maybe we need to change. Maybe we need to do this a little differently. And so again, this can be a severe barrier. Okay, given that, let me just check here for a second if there's any other comments that have come in. This is exactly why I showed you the picture in the very beginning of drinking from a fire hose. I wanted to try to lay out this landscape as clear as possible. I hope I'm not going too fast or giving you too much, but if nothing else, hopefully giving you some ideas, and you can go back and spend some time with the PowerPoint and reflect on some of these and think more about it. Just wanted to try to, a lot of times, 90 minutes is not a huge amount of time, but a lot of times some of these things are not discussed in leadership trainings that I've seen. And I think these are really important aspects of understanding the role we play as leaders, but also the landscape that we find ourselves as leaders. And sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's not so positive, and we need to figure out how to work effectively in that. So one of the things that can happen in an organization is, what I would just point out to you is the importance of organizational culture. And if you have a positive organizational culture, that's great. I've worked with some organizations when I've gone in to work on leadership issues, and I say, so what are your stated corporate values or organizational values? And they say, well, we don't have any. It's like, well, maybe you ought to think about developing some statements about who you are as an organization, what values you have that you want to reinforce in everything you do, so that if you have that, if you have some strong values, then it should organizational culture that reflect the values of an organization should guide the selection of leaders. In other words, if you value certain things in an organization, you're not going to find a leader who doesn't operate in consistent with those values. And then secondly, when you are trying to develop leaders, if you have values, you want to develop them in consistent with those values. So they should guide the development of leaders. That might be, we want our people to be better communicators, then send them to classes that improve communication skills or whatever, or conflict resolution skills or whatever it might be. So a good, strong organizational culture can guide the development of leaders, and it should serve as a barometer for successful leadership. In other words, the leaders should be doing things that reinforce and achieve the values of the organization. So one might ask, so what are some of those values? And hopefully most of you in organizations have some articulated values which guide and support effective leadership. Here are just a few that I offer up. One is being a learning organization. This is an idea put out years ago by some major leading organizational and leadership gurus, and the idea of just always being in a learning mode. What it does is it keeps us from being stagnant. It keeps us from thinking we know it all. It keeps us from going stale. We're always trying to learn. How can we do this better? How can we change our materials to be more effective? How can we reach out to the people we work with and be more effective with them? So continually learning from what we're doing. And it's kind of supportive of this idea of continuous quality improvement, which is kind of a buzzword now, and that's been the renaming of a concept that's been around for a long time, and about every 4 or 5 years it gets renamed, and somebody can sell another book. I'm not too cynical about that, but I've seen it so often in the learning, in the leadership, and in some other fields where we just kind of recycle old ideas, call it something new. But that idea has been around for a long time, this idea of continuous quality improvement, that we're always looking for how do we improve, how do we more effectively accomplish our goals. Transparency is huge. that we want to, as an organization, we want to be transparent. We want our staff in particular, also our clients, know how we operate and how we're making decisions and the basis on which we're making decisions. And this is a key part of facilitative leadership I'll talk about in a minute or two. Just mindful of our time. Yes, I do need to be mindful of time. Trustworthiness is a quality that we've talked about that is extremely important. So, Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong, we have about 15 minutes. Is that correct?
We have 15 minutes.
Thank you. I think, yes, this is a 3-minute video on servant leadership by Ken Blanchard, who is one of these well-known gurus on leadership. And I just thought, given everything we've talked about, it might just be kind of an interesting juxtaposition to hear some of his thinking on this. Hopefully this will be valuable. It's just 2 or 3 minutes. It's not very long.
You know, I get a lot of questions from people when I talk about servant leadership because they say, how can you serve and lead at the same time? They get confused and all. But what I really tell them is, first of all, the world is in desperate need of a different leadership role model. We've seen what self-serving leaders have done in a destructive way in every sector of society around the world because they think that leadership is all about them. And servant leadership it's really all about the people you're serving and what you're trying to accomplish. It's not about you. And servant leadership, to really be effective, starts in the inside. It starts in your heart with who are you as a human being. And the question I always ask is, are you here to serve or be served? That's a character question. And of course, a lot of people say, well, you know, of course I'm here to serve. I mean, who would say that I'm here to, you know, be self-serving? And yet we see all kinds of self-serving behavior. And so what we do is we follow that hard question up with taking a look at where are they in terms of their ego. See, because the thing that keeps people from their good intentions to serve rather than be served is the human ego. And there's 2 ways that people ego get in the way. One is false pride, when they have a more than philosophy, when they think they're brighter than, smarter than, and all. And they really put other people down. They're judging and evaluative and all. And everybody knows that's an ego problem, you know. But the other ego problem, a lot of people don't think it's an ego problem, is fear or self-doubt. When you come from a less than philosophy, and you say, gee, I'm not sure if I could do that, or am I good enough for this kind of thing? And the reason that's also an ego problem is, what are you focused on? You're focused on yourself. Gordon MacDonald has a real interesting concept along here. He says people are either called or driven. And driven people think they own everything. They own their people. They own their organization. They own their position, you know. And they're trying to control it. They're self-oriented. Where people are called, think everything is on loan. Their people are on loan. Their position is on loan, and all. And they're really other-directed. When you talk about service, we do want to move from an I, which is a self, to a we. And the we is, what are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to do here? And I want to tell you, the way this really gets powerful is when organizations realize that their number one customer is their people. And if you train your people, you motivate your people, you create a leadership culture and all, those people are going to feel fully engaged, they're going to feel valuable, and they're going to reach out and take care of your number 2 customer, which is the people who use your products and services. And when they treat them as if they really care about them and they're interested in what they're doing and want to find out what they need, not jam our products down your throat and all, they become raving fans of your organization. And that brings you, you know, more sales. They'd be almost part of your sales force. And that takes care of the owners and the profitability and all. Where we get in trouble and we get self-serving leadership is when people act like the only reason to be in business is to make profit. You know, profit is the applause you get for creating a motivating environment for your people so they take care of your customers. And so that's the power of servant leadership. That's what it really means for you to understand. And I want to tell you, it is not soft leadership. The only way I have seen organizations get great results and great human satisfaction is when people understand the power of servant leadership.
Okay, I hope you found that useful, and I find it very insightful, and it pulls together a lot of what we've been talking about, basically. And he's been studying leadership and working with people on leadership for his entire life. Clearly, that was targeting maybe toward the end there. He's talking more about a for-profit company, but the rest of it has totally to do with if we're in the public sector or just community leadership, serving people, families, whatever the case may be, all very, very relevant. So mindful of time, I want to move us along, get through a couple more slides, and then just open it up to any questions or comments people might have. So here's the model of facilitative leadership that I have found to be useful and where I usually focus most of our trainings. Now, we're doing this at the very end, but I hope you agree that providing a context for this is very, very important. And now you've got a framework for thinking about what we're talking about. And you can look at these ideas and think about them in a little more detail. And we can always come back to some of these. But first of all, be open to learning and adapting. I mean, I think a facilitative leader is always looking at how to learn and how to adapt in different situations, because when we're working, particularly most of us on this call probably are working with we're serving public, we're serving families, we're serving children, we're serving our communities, and they're always changing. So we need to be ready to adapt. The needs change, resources change, a lot of things are always changing. So we need to be learning and adapting. Secondly, we need to involve others in developing the shared vision. So as a leader, as we were saying before, at some point, the leader is going to have to be decisive and make a decision, but that can be after you've involved everybody in kind of developing a shared vision and what should our outcomes be, and you get people to buy into that. And not only they're buying into it isn't even quite the right phrase, they're helping develop it. And so then when you come to having to make some decisions, you're able to say, here's our decision. It came from these conversations. And I know I heard some other ideas too, but right now, given our resource or personnel limitations or whatever, I don't know that we can incorporate that, but it's something we can look at down the road. So people know that they've been heard, even if their idea wasn't ultimately selected. So there are ways to do that effectively. Developing the capacity of others. Always looking to how can we help other people build their own capacity to be a better speaker, to be a better writer, to interface with other people more effectively, whatever that might be. Listen effectively. Listening is definitely a skill set. Our tendency is to listen partially to people, then start thinking about what we're going to say, and then we quit listening. So effective leaders are able to effectively listen and really hear what people are saying and maybe pulling out of it not only content, but feelings and motive, and then trying to, effective listening involves what you might call reflective listening, which allows you to say back, well, let me see if I heard what you said correctly. What I hear you saying is, and you repeat that, and they'll either say, yeah, that's exactly what I mean, or no, not quite. I really meant to say this. So that level of communication is very important. Modeling transparency and trustworthiness, explaining why decisions are made, not just making a decision and leaving everybody wondering, well, why do you do that? And that helps build trustworthiness because people understand why you made a decision and what went into making that decision. And then when you follow through, people say, hey, that person's trustworthy. Balancing humility with the decisiveness, as we've talked about. Being able to either take responsibility when things don't work out well, but also giving credit when things do work out well, and acknowledging that and encouraging others. Recognizing and accounting for the impact of trauma. This is something I've added more recently, because what I realize is so many people, and of course, with our positive parenting program that we have, we deal with childhood trauma and resiliency a lot. And what we see from that research, which I think you all are very aware of, is that childhood trauma ACEs can carry over and impact people throughout their life. And we need to be more understanding of that and trying to recognize that when we realize what's going on. And it helps us with the next idea, which is having more empathy to understand, okay, this person may have gone through some challenging times that has led them to this set of circumstances that I'm dealing with. And so I think just as leaders, we just need to be able to recognize and account for the impact of trauma a little more effectively as part of having more empathy And then finally, ability to deal constructively with conflict. We can't be avoiders. We also can't be the people that are out there creating conflict because of our behavior and, you know, treating people in certain ways that then create conflict. So in a nutshell, that's facilitated leadership is. I define it, and when I do workshops, we break all these down in more detail with some examples. And but this is kind of the model, and this is what I would encourage all of you to kind of think about, and to the extent you can, with the other information we've discussed, think about how you incorporate this into the way you find yourself in leadership positions. And of course, some of this has to do with being in an organizational context. But we've also acknowledged that leadership can just be showing empathy to that one person and giving an encouraging word, or including them in a conversation, or asking their opinion of how they would do something, kind of evaluating them. So this is why I think this is a very powerful style of leadership, and one that serves you well as a leader, but also serves your organization well. I'm not going to speak to the last two slides, just to point out that they're there, that effective leadership requires effective conflict resolution skills. It begins with understanding how people react to conflict, either avoiding, accommodating, in other words, giving in to someone else, compromising, kind of the least common denominator solution, just what can we do to get out of this, usually is not the best way, competing or more aggressive, this is what I want to get out of this, and collaborating, which is, hey, I'm going to work with the other person, try to understand what their interests are, and figure out if we can come up with a solution. And that's all in the context then of, from the book Getting to Yes, which I highly recommend you read if you haven't. It's an easy read, written by a couple Harvard professors who are highly respected in the field of conflict resolution. And the book is called Getting to Yes, and they lay out the concepts of interest-based negotiation or conflict resolution, where you focus on the underlying interests. And that's the point at which you can actually start solving conflict. Separate the people from the problem, look for opportunities for mutual gain, try to be objective, and test assumptions before reacting or acting out. Okay, there's the fire hose. I'm turning it off, and with the few minutes we have left, I'd welcome any thoughts, any feedback, any questions, and be happy to answer anything that's on your mind. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening and staying with me through this. We do offer training and do leadership workshops. And so if you're part of an organization where you think you might benefit from a little more in-depth work in this area, contact me. I'm more than happy to talk to you about possibly supporting, you know, your situation if needed. So with that said, anybody want to?
Thank you.
And I'm all ears.
Oh, we're getting some nice thank yous. I'm going to bring it back to me really quick.
Good.
You will get Greg's slides following this webinar. You will receive an evaluation that we encourage you to fill out, and you will get his slides sent to you electronically. I want to remind you that all of our webinars are recorded, and you can find them on the Strategies 2.0 YouTube channel. We have our own YouTube channel now, so you can find this webinar and other past webinars that Strategies has done on our YouTube channel. I'd like to remind you that our next webinar is March 5th, and it will be Trauma's Effect on Mental Health. So please go on to our Strategies 2.0 website and see what webinars we have coming up that are offered to you at no cost, and also what trainings we offer throughout the state. Greg, that was wonderful. That was just such a good reminder to me of what I studied in my master's program, which was organizational leadership. So it was just really, really great reminder, great workshop. Thank you for providing your contact information to people so that they can get a hold of you if they want more information. So
My
with
pleasure.
that, yeah, I want to thank all of you that have attended today, and we hope to see you on our next webinars. And everybody have a great day. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you. Take care.